money changes, the demand for money curve shifts. And then we say, all right, the equilibrium will shift from E1 to E2 and the rate of interest increases. Don't do that. Please tell them that, but not immediately. Please tell them that now the demand for money curve is, the relevant demand for money curve is this. So this has become redundant. So at the same rate of interest R1, now people are demanding this much money. And how much is being supplied? This much, as originally. No change in the money supplies. So now we have excess demand for money. Demand, of course, as I've been telling you very often, has the first way in all assets. Where do we get hold of more money? By selling our return-giving assets, the bonds. So we start selling bonds, supply of bond increases, price of bond falls, and then the rate of interest starts climbing up. As the rate of interest starts climbing up, we start moving along the new relevant demand for money curve. And the demand for money starts falling. And once it has climbed up from R1 to R2, the demand for money falls sufficiently to give us the equilibrium in the money market. And the only way we could reach the equilibrium again in the money market was through an increase in the rate of interest. Because if the supply of money is not changing, demand for money has increased, so how will the demand for money and supply of money be again equal? If the demand for money falls by the same amount as it had increased by initially. That's the only way, because the supply of money is not changing. So it must come back to the original level to again be equal to the supply of money. Now, income has changed. You can't do anything about it because that is something that's external to the money market. So, how will the demand for money fall? By the same amount as it has increased by. If the rate of interest increases, and then we explain the entire process of selling the bonds and the price of bond falling and the rate of interest increasing. Now that's what's
if the job the money
pardon?
If the job the economic.
Oh yes.
If the job the
I mean it's not exorbitant. It's suddenly the demand has increased. It's not that you are having extra amount of money supply. Then you have to absorb it. In this case, you are not absorbing it as such. You are reducing again the demand for money to the same level as earlier because the supply of money has not changed. Right? Now, herein lies a very important point. So, at this point, and then we go there. Now, it is telling us a very important thing, which is going to come very handy, which we use very often. So now what has happened is this, that change when we are moving from this point to this point, by how much the supply of money has changed? This is zero. When we are moving from this point to this point, change in money supply is zero, right? But income has changed, right? Now slowly, things will this has changed. So this makes the demand for money change. We know that the sum total of the change in the demand for money has to be zero. Right? Now, let's see how beautifully it comes out. This is zero, change in money supply, real balance. So the demand for money has to be, change in the demand for money has to be zero. But this has changed, so this has to change. And this implies, since this entire thing is equal to zero, that K delta Y has to be equal to H. H is positive, K is positive. Delta Y is positive, so this entire thing is positive, so this has to be positive. So that means delta I has to be positive. So rate of interest has to increase. Now the question is, by how much the rate of interest has to change? And that's pretty simple.
didn't avoid much.
This tells us about the slope of the yield curve. Because K by H. Delta R divided by X. Delta R by delta Y. So that's nothing but the slope. Slope of the yield curve. Now, since I promised you that we'll be talking about the effects of all these coefficients on different aspects of ISLM framework, what we typically do, and is explained in the books, is that we say that, okay, given the H, if size of K is larger, then the slope is greater, or that will be steeper. If given the size of K, if H is larger, the ratio is smaller, the slope is smaller, and we are happy with that. And the students say, kya baat hai? He has explained us everything. Now the question is that what is the economics of this? Why is it that if K is greater, the slope of the level has to be greater? Yes, mathematics says that. Mathematics is pretty simple. But we are not supposed to be teaching mathematics in our classrooms, we are supposed to be teaching economics. So what's the economics behind it? Pretty simple, if we really think about it. You see, the change, if we are talking about the slope of the LM curve, which represents the money market equilibrium, then the external thing to the whole system in the money market comes from the goods market. That's from the change in income. You don't have any control over that in the money market equilibrium. So delta Y is given to us. When is the slope going to be greater? When delta, given the change in the income, if delta I, the change in the rate of interest is greater, the slope will be greater. Is it not? Given the size of delta Y, if delta I is greater, naturally this ratio will be greater. And that, we say, is dependent on K and H. How? As I said, that change in income is given from the outside. Right? Change in income is given from the outside of the money market. From the goods market. Now, what is the effect of this on the money market? That is this. Right. Now you see, greater is K, greater will be the increase in the demand for money. Right? Is it not? Yes. If K is greater, given the size of change in income, if the size of K is greater, naturally K delta Y will be greater. But then, to come back to equilibrium, the demand for money must fall by the same amount as it has increased by. So if K is larger, then K delta Y is greater, that is, the increase in the demand for money is greater. Then the decrease in the demand for money also has to be the same as the increase. And for a greater decrease, the rate of interest has to increase by more, given the size of H. Is it not? If this is larger, then this also has to be larger in terms of magnitude. Of course, it will be changing in the opposite direction. Is it not? So, to achieve a greater fall in the demand for money, do we need to change the rate of interest by a greater amount or a smaller amount? Of course, greater amount. So, if K is larger, given the change in the yield curve, the size of the change in rate of interest has to be greater, and therefore the slope has to be greater when K is larger. That's the economics. Now, given the size of the K and given the size of the income, that is, given the increase in the demand for money, by how much the rate of interest has to change is also dependent on it. If demand for money is highly sensitive, that is H to change in the rate of interest, that is H is greater, then the rate of interest has to change by a very small amount. Is it not? H represents what? The sensitiveness of demand for money to any given change in the rate of interest. So if H is greater, then the rate of interest has to change by a smaller amount to achieve the required change in the decrease in the demand for money. So if h is greater, the required change in the rate of interest will be smaller. So when h is greater, the slope of the L curve will be smaller because the required change in the rate of interest will be smaller given the change in the income. That's the Keynesian economics. Are you getting this? Yes. So when h is greater, the slope is smaller because the required change in the rate of interest is smaller. When k is greater, of course, the change in the rate of interest has to be greater, and therefore the slope has to be greater. Absolutely. It's not that economics is difficult. It's the thing, the thing is that we have to get into it. Right? And when you get into the whole thing, then everything becomes, very simple. And actually, beauty lies in simplicity. Right? Okay. Now, I think I dropped that off. Okay. Can we have that? Alpha G, delta G bar. I'm trusting my memory. And this is the thing that we have. Okay. So, since we are at it, so let's write the entire thing in terms of this is constant, this is constant. Alright, so we can do away with this. Now this is the slope of the IS. This is minus. This is the slope of the IS. Again, we have divided from the diagonals. Now, again, we can say that greater is alpha G and B, smaller will be the, the ratio, and therefore smaller is the slope of the Y. The real beauty lies in the Y's and the R's. Unfortunately, as I told you right at the beginning, that most of the books and therefore most of the teachers simply focus on the one of it, and things become very boring. This is not that. Simple algebraic manipulations. The beauty comes out when we talk about economics. So, can anyone explain this? That why is the slope going to be, say, smaller if alpha G or B is greater? Can you think about it in the same way? That's not explaining, the economics. All right, okay. Let me help you a bit. When we were talking about the LM curve, the slope of the LM curve, the money market equilibrium, I said that the starting point has to be something from outside the market, right? So now we are talking about goods market. So the first thing that you should focus on is that where is the change coming from? The money market. And what is it that we determine in the money market? The rate of interest. So, now we have to talk about this, that given the change in the rate of interest, by how much the income is going to change will determine the slope. This is external. We have to be very consistent about our analysis, right? So this is external. So this we are assuming to be given to us. Then what we have to see is by how much the income has to change. Now that's pretty simple. We know, all of us, that change in income has to be equal to the change in aggregate value. Right? Okay? Now, if the rate of interest changes, two things will happen. Investment will change. And if investment changes, aggregate value changes, then income will change and the consumption will change. Now, we are not talking about fiscal policy multiplier. We are saying the rate of interest has changed. If rate of interest decreases, then investment will increase, is it not? And if investment increases, aggregate demand will increase, income will increase, consumption will increase. So both of them will be positive. Is it not? If rate of interest increases instead, investment will fall, aggregate demand will fall, income will fall, consumption will fall. So in this case, both the consumption and investment are going to change in the same direction. Is it not? So the sum total of the change in the aggregate demand is dependent on by how much the investment is going to change and by how much the consumption will change. Now, why will the investment change? Because the rate of interest has changed. Now, both of them will be moving in the same direction. Because if delta I is negative, this entire thing will be positive. Income will increase and therefore this will also increase. If this is negative, this is positive, if the rate of interest increases, this entire thing will be negative. Aggregate demand will fall, income will fall, consumption will fall. So both of them will be changing in the same direction. Now, so by how much aggregate demand will change and therefore the income will change is dependent on the size of this, given the size of delta I. This value is going to be given to us from the outside. Greater is D, greater will be the increase in investment if the rate of interest has fallen by a certain delta I amount. Alright. And given the size of delta C, greater will be the change in aggregate demand, greater will be the change in income, given the size of delta I, smaller will be this. Let me go through it again. Given the size of delta I, okay, assuming that delta I is negative, alright. That's true for positive numbers also.
With the minus.
Because we have the minus sign, right?
Delta I also minus.
Right.
Delta I also minus.
Oh yes, both of them.
That's what
Exactly. So we are talking about magnitude, right? You know, we are talking about the absolute slope. This will of course be negative. And why is it negative? For the simple reason that if delta I is positive, that is the rate of interest is increasing, investment will fall, consumption will fall, aggregate demand will fall, income will fall. So this is increasing, this is decreasing, so the negative sign. Yes, sir. Pretty simple. So, now we know that it's negatively sloped. These two are moving in the positive direction. Now what we are talking about is the absolute slope. Right? And the absolute slope is dependent only on these two. So why is it that, of course, they are in the denominator, so this either of these two are greater, naturally the slope will be smaller. The absolute slope will be smaller. Is it not? Alright. So why is it so? Delta I is given. So by how much the aggregate demand and therefore the income will change is dependent on B. If B is greater, change in investment will be greater. Is it not? For any given change in the rate of interest. And if investment is greater, then change in aggregate demand will be greater. And if change in aggregate demand is greater, change in income will be greater. So given the size of delta I, if this is greater, this will be smaller. So if B is greater, this will be smaller. The slope will be smaller. It will be flatter. Okay. Now, given the size of the B, given the size of the delta I, by how much the aggregate demand will change is also dependent on C into 1 minus T. Now, C into 1 minus T determines the alpha T. Greater is C into 1 minus T, we have already talked about this, greater is alpha T. The Keynesian multiplier. What is the Keynesian multiplier? So, if C into 1 minus T is greater, change in consumption is greater, change in aggregate demand is greater, and therefore change in income is greater, making the slope smaller. So, if alpha T is greater, the slope of the I is going to be smaller. That's the requirement. Are you getting this? Alright. You see, unfortunately, I'm yet to come across a book that explains all these things. It's not difficult, we know them. That we have to apply our mind, that is all. And when we tell these things to our students, they're that much happier. That alright, now we know what is going behind the scenes. Right? Okay. That's interesting. let's move towards some more complicated things that